So Michelle, it's interesting to learn about Sina and May. You're in the apparel industry. That's a complicated industry to manage. If you were to list some of the kind of critical activities and processes in the sourcing and production phases, what are some of the things that somebody who perhaps wants to go into apparel manufacturing needs to think about in the sourcing and production stage?
I would say the number one thing would be looking for manufacturing partners. I think the easiest part of this is to design.
Interesting.
The hardest part is definitely finding partners that will work with you, especially if you're doing small runs or short runs, and then also partners that work well with you.
Right.
It's very, very important.
Right. And what does it take to make a bag? Can you talk me through that sourcing to production? Give me the 3-minute kind of tutorial on how you make a bag.
Okay. So it starts out with a sketch. The sketch then goes into sampling. Depending on who's doing your sampling, you can have a tech pack or a call-out sheet, which is basically like a blueprint of where everything goes. And then that goes into the sampling stage. It goes from the sampling stage on to hopefully the production sample.
Right.
And that usually goes to 2 to 3 iterations. And so once that's complete, then it'll go into actual production. And so that's kind of there's a lot of steps in between,
Right.
but those are the major steps that happen. And then once it goes into production, then obviously delivering to the customer, either the direct to consumer or through retail.
Wonderful. And so in sourcing, like something like this bag, for example, how many raw materials go into something like that from a counting point of view?
Okay, so you would think about the lining, the zippers, all of the finishing, so all of these things here, the fill that goes inside of the strap,
Interesting.
the thread. It gets very, very, very into the weeds.
Right. How do you know where to determine what all the raw materials are? Is that just trial and error?
Well, I mean, that's again having to change your mind frame from the big picture of I see a bag
Right.
to, okay, what makes up that bag?
Right.
It's kind of like if you want to make a cake, you're like, I want a cake, but you have to know all of the ingredients that go
Right.
in a cake or you're not going to have a really good cake.
Wonderful. So in terms of sourcing things like zippers and material and lining, in your experience, what's been the most challenging part of managing that sourcing process?
Timetables.
Timetables. Tell me more.
So all of our production is currently done in the United States.
Right.
But some of our suppliers, even if we go through them in the U.S., are still sourcing from China. And so you have to have at least 6 to 8 week lead time to be able to get the things that you need. So if you under order, you again can have that gap because
Right.
you have to make up for shipping time, sourcing time, and the supplier to actually get them to you. And so a lot of times what may happen if you're in a really, big pickle is that you would go with whatever's in stock.
Right. Yeah. And so that's interesting. So also not just timetables of the individual products, but then trying to synchronize the timetables across multiple products to make sure that you have everything just in time for
Yes.
production.
Correct. And they all have to be at the manufacturer at a certain time because
Right.
then the manufacturer has other customers and you have to fit into this window of basically opportunity.
Right.
And so if you don't, then you could kind of miss that window and it could slow down production.
Significantly.
Yes.
Interesting. When you manage the sourcing processes and activities and the production processes and activities, now that you're a left brain operations mindset kind of person, what are KPIs that you think about in the sourcing process and in the production process? Like what are some things that you think about to measure and monitor whether you're doing a good job of sourcing and production?
Definitely making sure that you have at least 8 to 12 months lead time in terms of product development. And also that allows for the lead time to be able to source the materials. And so for me, I would like to have, like I said, that window, because in that window, anything can happen. And in manufacturing, anything usually does.
Interesting. And on sourcing, how do you know if you have a good sourcing kind of an agreement or contract or not? Like what are you looking for in terms of an effective sourcing agreement?
Delivery.
So even their reliability of their delivery
Yes.
as well.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. So I've worked with some suppliers before who said, yes, we'll get this to you in at a certain date, and that date came and passed significantly and still didn't have the product. But if you give yourself that cushion of 8 to 12 months,
Right.
you can kind of make up for that. And that's why it's actually really good to have diversity of suppliers.
Is there anything that you could never in a million years have thought of about the manufacturing process for apparel? Like you just couldn't have imagined it.
How hard it is to actually have it made.
So tell me, why hard?
Well, for things that are semi-intricate or slightly more intricate, in the United States, it's actually really hard to find a manufacturing partner that's willing to do it. When I first started, I was a bit naive in thinking, well, I have money, I have a product, you have the skill, let's work together and magic will happen. Unfortunately, that's not the way it happened. And so finding the right manufacturing partner really is important.
And so you are currently producing and manufacturing locally, domestically in the U.S.?
Correct.
Interesting. And so did you ever consider going overseas for production?
I did initially consider going overseas for production, and I initially went into China. That didn't necessarily work out, I think, because there was I think you have to be on the ground to really have someone on the ground as an intermediary working for you. And at that stage, we did not have it. It was just myself. Going forward, I do like the idea of it being made in America and being able to pay a living wage. So anywhere that we went outside of the country, it would definitely have to be a place that has very stringent work and labor laws so that we can continue to make sure that we're paying a fair living wage to the individuals who are making our product.
Yeah, no, I think this is an important and insightful point, which is as you manage and kind of make decisions on your operation, thinking about the implications behind the scenes, who are those people that are managing these operations, that are working in these factories?
Exactly.
And kind of your potentially moral commitment, it depends on your kind of personal stance to them. So that's an interesting way to think about your operations decisions, the human idea. That's wonderful. Thank you. So Angela, thanks so much for sharing about Artefactus. I'm intrigued. I think, when you think about the value chain for a company like Artefactus, the sourcing stage has to be interesting, right? First of all, tell me how many different products or SKUs that you carry currently, and when you step back from that, how many different raw materials go into all your SKUs?
Okay, so we have around 40 different styles combined, between necklaces, bracelets, rings, keychain. And I would say in average, every product has 4 to 5 different colors. So every color has a different SKU.
Wow.
So I would say around 140, 160
different
SKUs that we manage. Now, in terms of materials, we use, I would say, approximately 10 kind of seeds between orange peel, coffee beans, cantaloupe seeds, tawa nut, St. Peter's tears, bonbona seeds. So I would say around 10 to 12 different materials.
Right.
Like seeds, between seeds and peels.
Okay. And in addition to your kind of core materials and your core raw materials, what was the raw material perhaps that was the most unexpected that you realized you had to source, that you hadn't thought about it until you started the business?
Well, obviously, orange peel for me was it was interesting to think about orange peel being part of a beautiful piece of necklace.
Right.
Just because I didn't want a slice of orange look like an earring, right?
Right.
To me, it had to have a different kind of shape that didn't even look as an orange peel.
Right.
So for me, the fact that we had to go and recycle that from street juice vendors or restaurants and then create a shape out of it, I think that would be the material for me that really surprised me the most.
So when you manage sourcing, especially because you're using recycled material, what are the steps that you have to go through to identify those recycled materials? And what's the challenge about managing a process where the input materials are not something you can kind of buy in a traditional kind of bulk setting?
Correct. So quality, I would say, one of the things. Because when we go and we really go into the garbage bags of the juice vendor, the street juice vendor guy.
Right.
And basically, we handpick what peel looks that would work to make a flower or
Right.
to make a knot.
Right.
So it is because some of them are too thick, some
Interesting.
of them are too thin, depending on the type of orange, So that I would say quality or the special quality that peel has to have.
Right.
It could be challenging.
So the quality control process is on the inbound side for your sourcing of the raw materials.
Correct. Yeah.
And do you have, so this is interesting because it's not a traditional kind of raw material product. Do you have contracts with your vendors, might I call them, for these recycled materials? How do you ensure that you can get the volume that you need in the sourcing stage to sustain your customer demand?
It depends on the seed or the peel. So orange peel, that is there. It is there. So we just
okay.
go and it's
So
there.
there's more
How much
supply
you
than
want.
demand, so it's not a
Correct.
constraint.
Yes, because
Okay.
there is tons of waste, right? So
Interesting.
we just go and it is there, and we
Right.
are trying to recycle
That's
a portion of
interesting.
that. Now, when we talk about tawa, for instance, which is this nut,
Right. And so where would you source that from?
so this comes in Colombia. It comes mostly from the Amazon area or the Pacific coast. And with that, we do work with a supplier who has a farm because this is a palm tree.
Okay.
So the tawa, it looks like a coconut. The fruit
Right.
looks like a coconut, and every coconut has around, could have 25, 30 of these nuts inside. So it is sustainable because it's just the plant produces it, right?
Right.
Every so many months. So with that, we do have to source it from the farmer
Right.
of the plantation, and then we have to bring it back to the main city, to Bogota in my case,
Right.
to process it and produce the final.
And so with either your non-traditional kind of recycled raw materials or this more traditional material that you have an established vendor contract with, what's been the most challenging part of managing getting those materials from your source into the production line?
What is the most challenging?
Yes.
Again, I would say quality in the sense that when we are creating a piece of jewelry, we have, because the product has to be good, right?
Right.
So we have to be, in this case, for instance, we have to make sure that the acai or acai berries have a similar shape,
Okay.
a similar size,
Right.
because you don't want to have like a big seed with a small seed,
Right.
and all of that. So it becomes very challenging because it's nature, right?
Right.
So they just produce it the way it is.
Right.
So in that sense, we work with our supplier in basically hand-picking the pieces to make every necklace. So that's why I say every necklace is really unique.
Right. So when you're kind of stepping back and maybe even handing off some of the sourcing activities to someone else, perhaps your hire an operations manager, from a metrics point of view, how do you tell that you're doing a good job in your sourcing process? Do you have any metrics that you think about or manage or monitor?
The metric that I have for that in general is how many pieces of those we send back to the
Interesting.
manufacturer. It has happened to us that we receive the necklaces here, and as I said, it doesn't really look good because the sizes of the seeds are not, they don't look right.
Right.
With orange peel also, sometimes when they make a flower, I don't have a style here, but there are styles that have two flowers together.
Right.
And sometimes one flower looks a lot bigger than the other one.
Right.
So it doesn't look pretty. So we just send that back.
Interesting.
So I think for me, the KPI in that sense is the percentage of product that we send back for reproduction.
Right. The reworks.
So the reworks.
Interesting. And just for us to kind of visually understand what's happening, when you say the production line has a defect, where is that production happening? Is this happening in the location of each of the different artisans? Is that what you mean?
It
Okay.
is.
And how many
Yeah.
artisans do you have currently?
We are working with 6 artisans at the moment.
I see. So these are all in very independent locations.
They are.
Are 6 different people making the same product at some point?
Yes, sometimes we do. Some of them, like the more complicated ones, we have this just one artisan.
Okay.
That she sometimes when she needs help for
Right.
production, she teaches. She has an assistant that helps her. But for others, like for instance, that one, we have 2 or 3 different artisans that are able to create the knots. So depending on their capacity and the quantity of the orders, we will ask either or. But yes.
And how do you how are the artisans in different locations able to make the same product consistently?
It's very standard.
I see.
So these artisans, as I said, are very vulnerable women in Colombia, so they don't have like a lot of means. But we do work a lot through WhatsApp and that kind of technology. So through pictures. So we send pictures and like we zoom in and we say like, this is how I want it. So they count like the number of knots, how many. So that's the way we can standardize the product when we work with different artisans. So through WhatsApp, that's what we do it, and through pictures.
So now standard operating procedures are being shared via WhatsApp.
Yes.
Who knew?
Plus I have my mother actually is the one who manages the operations in Colombia.
Interesting.
So she is the one who manages the artisans there, and she makes sure she works with them directly, and makes sure that the product is as standard as possible.
Right. And at this point, are you how can you kind of get a sense of the capacity of those 6 or 7 artisans? Mm-hmm. Do you have a number in your mind? Like, do you have a sense of how fast they work and what their production rates are? And
so I can tell that they can produce around 10 to 12 necklaces a week.
Oh, wow.
Really. And so if I would say that a year long, we are able to produce around 3,000 or 3,500 necklaces, depending also on every necklace.
Right.
So this one, for instance, requires a lot more work because it has crochet and it requires more time than this one. This one is just putting 5 towels together.
Right.
And so every style has their own time of production, if you will. And so that is what makes it vary, like the variation on timing and number of products. But we have in mind like around 3,000 to 3,500 a year with only these 6 artisans. But the idea is as we scale, right, how we can bring more and more artisans into the business. And in Colombia alone, there are 1.2 million artisans that depend on craftsmanship to live. So there is big opportunity for us to help more and to bring more and to increase our production, and eventually also like improve their efficiencies. Efficiencies, correct?
Right.
Like probably we can start providing them, and we have in a small scale providing them with some technology so they can improve the process.
Right.
But that we are doing it as we grow.
Absolutely. Wow. Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting production line.
Thank you.
Andrew, I would have no idea operationally how to source and produce an electronics product. Tell me, what does it take to do that?
So, where do I start?
Yes.
It is a complex area to work in, particularly when you're producing overseas, and there really aren't a lot of sourcing and manufacturing options here to do the kind of tech accessories we do.
Right.
So when I started the business, I was just doing flash drives, and I started out just finding suppliers on Alibaba. And back in 2010, I could still find some suppliers, but it's very difficult to be able to qualify them, know how good the factories were, things like that. It was a simpler process with one product, but in 2013 and then into 14, we started to expand from just doing flash drives to doing cables, Bluetooth speakers, battery packs.
Right.
And as we expanded our product line, it got a lot more complex on having to find many factories to work with, and how we manage all of our quality control, how we handle the actual logistics and getting product from Asia into the US. And that was a huge learning curve for me. Fortunately, one of the ways I was able to get around that learning curve was to find partners with a lot of experience, who knew what to look out for and how to be able to take our one product line, move us into about 10 products, and do that effectively overnight. And so the way my current sourcing structure works is very similar to how it started in 2013. So the way we do sourcing now is that I have one very key employee, and he's someone who has done sourcing, manufacturing, and everything in between, from designing products to overseeing production lines in Asia for the last 30 years.
Okay.
So he is truly an expert, and he was able to really establish our sourcing process.
Thanks for sharing some of your sourcing process. I'm curious, when you look at your resource list, like what are all the inputs that go into making an electronics product? Tell me what that resource list looks like, for everything from tangible as well as intangible resources that go into this process.
Yeah, so it's a very long list,
Okay.
especially with all the products we do. But if we take this product, for example,
Right.
our charging cables. This is our leather charging cable, and we have about 20 SKUs of different cables. But when I look at producing one of these, we have to look at what goes into the materials of the actual leather,
Right.
how it's stitched, then all of the cable and wiring inside,
Right.
to tips. Do we do them in aluminum, in plastic? And then what's under them? What are the PCBs that are going on in here, and how does every little component have to secure to each other?
Right.
So our resource list is, for a product like this, can be dozens of items. Fortunately, that's why we have experts.
Right.
And I have one person in particular who's internal, who will make sure that every one of these components is up to our quality standards.
Interesting.
And what makes us different is that all of our products are high-end, and we don't deal with junk. So there are a lot of really poorly made cables and electronics.
Right.
And we try to stay above the fray there. And so making sure that our components are well sourced and that everything is built to a very high quality standard is most important to us.
Right. So going into your sourcing process, you actually have pre-established KPIs around what your minimum quality requirements are for each component. And then as you're doing sourcing, you're making sure that any possible available options meet these requirements.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. We have a lot of different component requirements, but what's actually more important is the quality control after the product's produced. So something like a product like our cable here, every one of these gets plugged in.
Right.
We test the output. Once it's built, we then will do strength tests, and we'll swing the cables, we'll
Right.
pull them, stretch them,
Right.
and all of the cables get tested.
Right.
That's the most important part, and in being able to ensure that when we're creating 20, 30,000 cables,
Right.
that every single one's tested and our quality is in line with what our requirements are.
Right. So when we see them doing dummy crash tests for cars, you're basically doing the same thing for your cables.
Yeah, we don't. Unfortunately, our process isn't nearly that cool.
Right.
But we do a lot of different tests
Right.
to ensure quality standards are there.
Bruce, Organic Living Superfoods, interesting products, unique product line, 108 products at its height. Tell me what it takes to maintain in terms of number of raw ingredients and inputs into that process. How many raw ingredients do you have to source to support 108 unique organic products?
Yeah, probably close to 350.
Interesting. And so that sounds like it's complex. And these are really unique products. Tell me where some of the products come from.
It's interesting. I mean, I've searched the world over, but we have these jungle peanuts that come from the mountains of Ecuador. They're grown
Interesting.
by hand by the Ashuar Indians, and that's their only source of income. They're hand harvested,
Wow.
and they have to carry them to a port and fly them all over the world. But we get our almonds from Valencia, Spain, because you can't buy raw almonds in the United States. They have to be pasteurized according to the FDA.
Right.
We get our cashews from either the Ivory Coast of Africa or Vietnam, which is one of the largest suppliers of cashews in the world. And Brazil nuts come. A lot of people think they come from Bolivia, but the majority of them come from Brazil. But a lot of them come from. Most of them come from Bolivia.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, what are some things we should think about as we're sourcing? Because that sounds like a complex kind of undertaking. As you're managing these contracts and sourcing these new ingredients, as a startup, what should I be thinking about?
I think you really need to go to these trade shows, and you need to meet some of those buyers. You'll meet the buyers, you'll meet the suppliers, and in a lot of cases you'll meet the farmers.
Right.
And they can tell you their growing practices. And if you are thinking of going 100% organic, that's essential, because you need to make sure that they're complying with USDA standards. And you just need to really keep a close eye on market conditions, and you need to know that certain things aren't available certain times a year. Like
Interesting.
I found out the hard way that the jungle peanuts were only available 3 months out of the year.
Interesting.
So,
And so how do you manage that? How do you manage the fact that you're a growing, successful business, your demand is increasing, but perhaps you're not able to keep up with the supply?
you definitely have to have somebody who's good at projecting. If
Interesting.
you're growing 10% month over month, you have to provide for that, and
Right.
even extra. And a very good way is to, a lot of suppliers will do contracts, which will lock in a price for the year to prevent, so you wouldn't have to change your price within that contract period.
Interesting.
So like I contracted for raw Valencia Spanish almonds last year for $4.50.
Right.
And right now they're at about $5.35, but I'm locked in till December. So
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Are there other products that they will not have long-term prices, and how do you manage the fact that your customers have a certain price point expectation, but your raw material pricing cost may be changing?
yeah, I mean, you can 9 times out of 10 you can contract with a broker of the product, but
Right.
the farms generally won't contract. So. And it becomes a lot easier to deal with a broker, because they might charge a little bit extra, but you don't have to deal with importing
Right.
into the United States. You don't have to deal with FDA coming and holding onto your product until they test it
Right.
and making sure it meets their guidelines. This is all done for you,
Right.
and you don't have to hire an international broker to get it into the country. So
Right.
those are a lot of efficiencies you can have with a broker.
So it sounds like using a broker is a wonderful kind of efficient way to source lots of different products.
Yeah.
Do you ever have to go to these? I'd love to go to Bolivia. Do you ever have to go to Bolivia and to these other countries to do any of your sourcing process?
No, I mean, I do a lot of vetting, so on my own, a lot of
Right.
investigation, and you just want to make sure, number one, they're not hiring underage children, and
Interesting.
number two, that they're sanitary, their farms, and you can tell a lot of times, because I mean, we cull all our materials for foreign matter, and
Interesting.
sometimes things sneak through, and that's
Right.
a problem if there's
Right.
a rock in the
Right.
almonds, or
Right.
and a customer gets it.
Right.
So.
And so if, let's say, something happens to a raw material, how do you manage that in terms of returning it? Is that typically paid for by the supplier? What are
Most-
some of the challenges as a startup that you have to think about?
Yeah, most of the brokers will take the product back if
Right.
you can show. But when the tractor trailer gets there, even if the pallet is damaged, you
Right.
have to make a note of that, and you have to let the trucking company know, and you're covered insurance wise. But if you take it in and tell you, it must have happened on the truck, it's too late. You have
Right.
to let them know right then and there.
Yeah. So this is I think a really insightful point for startups, which is, as much as we study and understand our customers and our customer markets, really having in-depth knowledge and understanding about your supply markets. What are the prices? What's the availability? When is it? Do you have enough supply to meet your demand needs and projected demand needs into the future?
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting and helpful point for startups. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So right, so now you have all these interesting raw materials. Now you actually have to produce the product. Tell me, especially for an organic product, what does it mean to have a production line that's organic certified?
If it's organic certified, basically, if you have anything that's non-organic, it has to be segregated, it has to be
Interesting.
labeled.
Wow.
And the utensils that you use to even handle that has to be kept completely separate. It's not inordinate to have something that's not organic in some of your ingredients, but
Right.
they have to be kept completely separate, and they can't be intermingled.
Right.
And they
right.
will check for that when they come in and do the audit.
Wow. And just in general, as a startup, tell me about kind of the equipment. Identification and purchasing and
Yeah.
procurement. Is that a big issue for you? Was that a big part of your startup budget? Talk to me about
It is a big issue, because when I started, we dehydrate everything. We don't
Right.
cook anything. We started with one little $300 dehydrator,
Right.
and now we have a room full of them, probably about $300,000 worth of dehydrators. And
Right.
the next level up is building a dehydrator room, which is about $120,000 just the room itself. But
Right.
as you increase sizes, everything becomes more efficient, and you're saving on one end, and you're investing into your future. So
Right.
you have to do that, and you have to just keep growing, or you're just not going to be able to keep up with demand.
Right. In terms of KPIs for your production process, how do you know you're doing a great job in the production process once you have your raw materials and getting it out the door to your customers?
I mean, you just constantly have to run the numbers, and you have to do tests and figure out how many packages a crew of 3 can pack in an hour, and
Right.
constantly check the numbers and make sure that's happening, and how many pounds you can produce with the equipment that you have.
Right.
And then, I mean, we just got an order for 16,000 pounds of product, and we figured our maximum run right now is 3,000 pounds every 3 days. So we knew that it was going to take us about 15, 16 days to produce
Wow.
all that product.
Right.
So we were thinking about outsourcing it to another company who does something similar to us, but we ended up doing it ourselves, and just buying about 10 more of smaller dehydrators that to hold about maybe 100 pounds each. So we're able to add 1,000 pounds every 3 days to our production.
And in that decision to go in-house with that production of that large order versus outsourcing, what was the kind of final decision making
I mean,
factor?
for me, it's just quality control. I don't like to. Eventually, I know I may have to outsource at
Right.
some point in time. Maybe
Right.
not, but I just need to know that I need to be there, and I need to make sure. Just for an example, I walked by. I was in the warehouse showing somebody around. I walked by the boxes that were packed and ready to go out the door, and I put my hand on the box, and it was warm. So they're nuts. They're in a plastic bag.
Right.
They're warm, and it's sealed.
Right.
So all you're asking for is moisture and mold.
Right.
And so I had my warehouse guy open everything up, let
Right.
it cool down. But if I hadn't walked by at that moment, who knows what would have happened to that product?
Right. So your ability to have kind of hand-on quality control
Yeah.
was your deciding factor to keeping things in-house.
Yeah, definitely.
That's good advice. Good
Yeah.
advice. Thank you.
Sure.
So, gents, Lula sounds like an intriguing idea. This idea of ride sharing for college students on college campuses. That sounds like a little bit of a nightmare. But on the other hand, sometimes when we think about apps, we don't think about operations. You know, when we think about sourcing and producing, a lot of times it's easier to imagine that for a food and beverage company, where you can imagine the raw materials and you can imagine the process of transforming those raw materials into final products. So for an app, what are you sourcing, and what would you say you're producing, and what are some of the steps that go into that? I'm intrigued to hear what sourcing and production look like in the app world.
Yeah, absolutely. So for us, and I think with an application, you can go there's a variety of ways that you can go when you're trying to source the work. And
Right.
so if you're a developer yourself, you're kind of the source yourself. So
Right.
you can develop the application yourself,
Right.
develop the website and all that. And so from that perspective, it's different.
Right.
For somebody like ourselves, which we're not necessarily technically savvy and we're not the actual developers,
Right.
for us, we actually had to go source a team to develop the application for us and help
Right.
us with all the software side of things.
Right.
And so for us, what we did was we ended up getting introduced to a development team. And we held interviews with different companies and all that, and we ended up narrowing it down to one company. And so at first, and this was a little more than a year ago, we were a bit naive at the time. We thought, okay, you know what? This is a development team. They have some sort of experience in
Right.
the past developing apps. Let's entrust them to build the app.
Ah.
And so that was an error that we made early on.
Right.
We kind of gave them the reins and said, okay, this is what we want. You guys have full control over it.
Right.
And so during that process, we ended up realizing how wrong we were in functioning like that and operating like that. And so what we learned from that experience, we ended up having to switch development teams
Interesting.
after a while. What we ended up learning was that although we're not developing the application, we have to be extremely, extremely involved. And so a basic example was we would have to, so for vehicle VIN numbers,
Right.
this is just a basic example. Vehicle VIN numbers, there's different databases here in the United States that allows you to input the vehicle's VIN number and
Right.
then you can verify that it's a legitimate car,
Okay.
right? And so this development company had no experience with that. Of course, we had no experience with that.
Right.
But at the time, we're like, oh, they're a development team. They should know it.
That's right.
But we were wrong. And so from our part, what we ended up having to do was we had to source these APIs. We had to hold these meetings with like admins and the National Highway of Transportation
Right.
Association. All that stuff we had to source. And then we ended up having to source different APIs.
Right.
Like for example, Matthew
And
was-
when you say source an API, define first what an API is, and how does one source an API?
Yeah, basically, so an API is an application program interface.
Okay.
And what they do is they make the development process much easier.
Okay.
And so instead of us having to build out a kind of like a base of code or basically write out some code,
Right.
there's companies that have already
Build different
Done it for you.
components.
exactly
Right.
they have done it for you, and you can basically get that and implement it into your application.
As a plug and play kind of a
Exactly.
component. Right. So where does a person buy? I know where to buy raw materials if I was a food company. Where does a person buy and source APIs?
So a lot of it just comes from, so for instance, a lot of different websites, Facebook, if you go onto their platform, they
Right.
have a lot of the guidelines, and then a lot of that is
Interesting.
step by steps.
Okay.
For instance, another one that's very popular is MailChimp. It's not as high tech as you'd imagine for an app like ours, but it's one of the more commonly used ones.
Okay.
And something like that can easily be implemented
Right.
on the website. And the way that we sourced it was we kind of saw what numbers we thought we'd be doing in terms of sign-ups, how many emails we'd be sending a month.
Right.
And then trying to see which ones provided us with the best templates and just which were the most affordable. And then at the end of the day, which were also the easiest to implement with this API.
Right.
And
So
then
you're saying, just for people who might not be that familiar, you have an app. There's some part of your process whereby you need to notify your customers by email of some event. And instead of building out that email notification process, MailChimp, that's a company that
Yeah.
does email
Yeah.
contact management and notifications, you were able to use their technology and kind of plug and play that API
Exactly.
into the
Exactly.
Lula system. Okay, that's
Exactly.
interesting.
So they take care of the sending. We kind of just make a pretty template, a
Right.
design, or a pretty email, and
Right.
then we'll say who we want to send it to, and then
Right.
they just do it for us.
Okay.
So it makes life way easier like that.
So right now here, what I hear you saying is you've sourced human capital, you've sourced human resources in terms of development team. Sometimes you've had to source API. What are some of the other things that are inputs into developing an app, or in particular for Lula, that you've had to source?
So so the APIs we had to the human capital, like you mentioned,
Right.
in terms of like design and stuff.
That's right.
We also
Design and development, of course.
exactly. So
Right.
all that stuff was different things that we sourced in terms of, and I think this was something very important that we didn't pay attention to much early on, or put a lot of attention towards, is there has to be a way to get customer feedback. And I think sourcing that customer feedback and
Interesting.
sourcing not necessarily customer feedback in, I think there's a difference between customer feedback when they're telling you, the founder, what they think,
Right.
but I don't think that's the valuable feedback necessarily. I think valuable feedback comes when it's cold, in the sense that they're not telling you face to face. So how do you source that candid customer feedback
Right.
for them to be completely open and transparent,
Right.
and really tell you what they feel, as opposed to being in your face and kind of feeling bad that they're not necessarily.
Interesting. And so how does one source that kind of a customer feedback?
So for us, we were sending out a ton of surveys.
Right.
So we'd send out a bunch of surveys to friends, family,
Right.
friends of friends, acquaintances. We would
People
put-
don't really care when it's through a computer.
Yeah.
They're a lot more honest when they don't
Right.
have to look you straight in the face.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, we had a lot of, on each of the campuses we were on, we had brand ambassadors.
So you have to source the brand
Yeah,
ambassadors
so we had
as
to
well.
source them, but those
Right.
brand ambassadors were great because they're kind of our ears on each of these campuses, and
Right.
a lot of the feedback that people didn't, I guess, have the nerve to tell us in person, they'd feel comfortable telling the ambassadors, who a
Right.
lot of times they saw as a friend or even a peer on campus, so they were immediately more comfortable with them.
Right.
So that was one great way of sourcing feedback and criticism and things of that nature.
Yeah. I
One
think-
thing that you'd mentioned too was a background check. So I'm curious, is that a vendor that you source that does your background checks for you?
Yeah.
Because certainly that's not something you'd want to
Yeah.
do.
It
So-
very much, I guess, this is again something that we hadn't thought about prior. When people think about building an application,
Right.
they think, oh, you basically go, you write some code, and all of a sudden you put it on the App Store and you launch it.
Right.
And people think, and I've learned this through time. People think an app is an app,
Right.
but what people need to realize is that an app is very much a company.
Exactly.
And I think that's where a lot of people make an
Right.
error.
Right.
They just see an app and they're like, oh, okay, that's just an app. But
Right.
it
Just,
very
that's
much
just code.
yeah, it
Right.
very much is a company
Right.
with people that are part of it. There's a marketing department. There's in some of the larger companies an HR department.
Right.
So there's all these different components to it
Right.
that many people don't see. And so when you start thinking about an application, I think it's very important that you start thinking about it as a typical business. You
Right.
need to source, like you said, you need to source the development, the developers, the designers, these companies that have these APIs. And I think you really need to start looking at it more as a legitimate business.
Right.
Just like somebody would go source
Raw materials.
raw materials for
Right.
their business, you're basically doing the same thing for your app. It's just in a different form.
Yeah.
So you might be doing it through the internet. You might be.
That's right.
And so you're literally Googling companies and you're searching up. So when we needed background checks, we needed a company to work with us for background checks. We basically did what many other companies do when they're trying to source raw materials. We went on to Google and we searched background check companies.
Right.
And we went on to like AngelList and Crunchbase, and we searched for that, and that's how we were sourcing it.
That's
and
right.
we looked at with some of the bigger companies, so like Uber, for instance. Our goal one day is to be at that level,
Right.
and so we wanted to do things as closely as we can, the same as them in terms of operations. So we saw a couple of the different background checks at the companies that they were working with,
Right.
and so we decided to go speak with them. And there was about 3 of them,
Right.
and then again we just saw which ones were the best. So for instance, one that we ended up using or are going to end up using, they were by far the most willing to work with us in terms of adjusting prices on the mass, so that when we hit certain numbers in scale, our prices would drop. Additionally, they were willing to waive the setup fee for the APIs.
Okay.
So right off the bat, just their willingness to help. And then also, we're a company that really wants to be something, or we want to do things on demand. So if
Right.
somebody wants to sign up and rent a car out in 5 minutes and create
Right.
that profile quickly,
Right.
this was the fastest company. So for instance, in some states like North Carolina, we can get these background checks in as little as 5 seconds. So
Interesting.
things like that, just trying to figure out, we came up with a list of needs that we wanted, which
Right.
was affordability for us as a young startup.
Right.
Who was the quickest in the background checks, and also who was able to get us the background checks from the most places. So a lot of these background checks, companies don't do
In
checks
certain-
in like
certain
Puerto
states,
Rico.
right.
This one did, for instance. So
Right.
we came up with a list of our needs, and we just saw which one of these companies fulfilled those needs, and that's how we essentially sourced it.
I think that's incredible too, that, you know, as you're making your source decision, for example, on the background checks, that your metric, your KPI around kind of the speed to, you know, from time of inquiry to completion of the delivery check of the background check is consistent with your convenience, mission and vision and value proposition, right?
Yeah.
So you're saying that as you're doing your sourcing, your decisions operationally have to align with the greater
Exactly.
objective.
Yeah,
right? So
we-
everything is in service operationally to the greater mission.
Yeah, with us is we have a vision of what we expect the company to be and what we want
Right.
it to be, and when we're sourcing, everything has to be what's going to get us closer to that step.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now let's say you have all your resources in place. How do you transform that? What are some of the kind of big challenging process steps that has to occur to go from these resources to the final product or service that I see in the app in my hand when I'm on my phone?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges for us is we have our development team, and then obviously we're working with these different companies that
Absolutely.
they're giving us their APIs and when they're allowing
Right.
us to do that. And so communication is a huge part of it. And not only communication between us and the development team, but at times there needs to be communication between our development team and, for example, this background check company.
Right.
And so communication is a huge challenge. And
Right.
so how do we get all those people aligned to work together and to talk together?
Okay.
And so that is something that we've gotten better at. And so a typical thing is it's nothing out of the box. Sit down, all right guys, let's all jump on a phone call together.
Right.
Let's discuss this.
Right.
And so one of the things that's important for us is we have to sell our development team on the greater picture, and we have to sell the background check company on the greater picture.
Right.
And say, if we're able to come together and work together, this is what we can achieve. And so for us, it was not only communication and communicating kind of our like long-term vision and our goals was something that was essential to like the completion of the...
Yeah, because one thing that most people would never think about is, for instance, one of the things that we rely heavily on is insurance. So nobody ever thinks of, okay, the insurance brokers are going to have to eventually get in contact with developers or something like that.
Right.
But we have to make that happen because our policies have some sort of mention them has to be in the terms and agreements when somebody agrees to them.
Right. So if
things
there are changes, then you need to be able to update those to reflect those.
Exactly. So
Right.
even small things like that, just putting the insurance company in contact with the developers or even the background check company, having them, because they have their own terms and policies that
Right.
that we have to agree on. So having them agree to it with our developers, I mean, just like Michael said, the communication is so important. And although sometimes it sounds simple, like, yeah, just put so-and-so in
Right.
contact, when you're managing so many different groups, for instance, where we probably have 5 or 6 different groups that we're trying to keep in contact and kind
Right.
of bring things together, I mean, it can get tough.
Of course, of course. I'm sure that Lula has changed since pilot to today. In terms of managing that production process, that development process. Do you have metrics and goals there? What's the lead time typically from the time that you come up with a new idea of something you want to roll out in Lula till when, as a customer, I see it in the app, and what's your target? What's the actual and what's your target?
Yeah, so our target is we want from the time that somebody complains to me or tells me something
Right.
is wrong with the application,
Right.
we'd like that to be fixed within a week.
Okay.
And so we'd like to operate quickly. Now, is that always the case? Do we always see that change?
Right.
No. It's honestly most of the time right now, it takes a little longer. But usually our lead line, we'd like our lead time to be about a week. In reality, it's a little longer. And so, just going back to what we've said before, communication and scheduling is something
Right.
that we're always. So, for example, with our development team, we're using Pivotal Tracker. Pivotal Tracker kind of lets us know where the developers are, what they're
Wonderful.
working on, all that stuff, and we're able to see it in real time. And so now that's just a quick problem if we have to fix like a bug or something. Now,
Right.
if all of a sudden it's a huge, like for example, we redesigned the full application, and one of the processes we redesigned was the whole login and sign up process.
Right.
That's something that for us it took about four to 5 weeks to do.
Right.
So, in terms of like lead time and all that for something we'd like it to be ideally a week. If it's a big change, obviously like 4 weeks. But
Right.
we really try to work quickly and really try to get things going as soon as possible.
Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Sounds like your operation is well underway then.
It's improving.
It isn't. It's still a work in progress,
Yeah,
but
it's
we're
a work
getting
in
there.
progress.
Okay, I like it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.